Welcome. My name is Jonathan Sarna. I'm the director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies here at Brandeis, and it's really my great pleasure to welcome you to our discussion with Gershom Gorenberg concerning his really spectacular new book, a page-turner entitled War of Shadows. The Codebreakers, Spies, and the secret struggle to drive the Nazis from the Middle East. Gershom Gorenberg is a journalist, a visiting professor at the Columbia Journalism School, senior correspondent at the American Prospect, before then at the Jerusalem Report, and he's really a remarkable writer and scholar whose book, The Accidental Empire, Israel and the Birth of the Settlements, really remains the standard history of the settlement movement, and his other books, including The End of Days, which is about fundamentalism and the struggle for the Temple Mount, as well as his The Unmaking of Israel, are all required reading for those in the field. Gershom's books, and particularly true of this volume, rest on a mountain of primary research, including painstaking archival research and interviews, and that's really what gives them their great quality. Now, joining me in our conversation about War of Shadows is my distinguished Brandeis colleague, Professor Yehudah Mirsky. He's professor of Near Eastern Judaic Studies here. He is, in his own right, a well-known writer and blogger, a specialist on the era of the British Mandate, of course, author of two highly significant books on Rav Kook. I should say that both Yehudah and I are longtime friends of Gershom Gorenberg, so we have been looking forward to this conversation. And we invite you in the audience to join us as well. If you have questions or comments, please put them in the chat. Do not use Q&A, which isn't really supposed to be working. Use the chat, and in about 40 minutes, my colleague, Dr. Shana Weiss, the Associate Director of the Schusterman Center, will really moderate a question period using your questions and addressing them to Gershom. But for now, Yehudah, I wonder if you can start us off. First question for Gershom.
Sure, with pleasure. So first off, just I have to say that not only am I an avid reader of Gershom's for a long time and a longtime friend, but Gershom knows that he was not one of the very best editors I was ever privileged to have during the years that I was writing for Jerusalem Report, something for which I'll always be very grateful. And you mentioned, Jonathan, the remarkable research capabilities that Gershom brings to bear, which is true, but no less remarkable in general, and certainly in this book, is Gershom's ability both to mine archives, including those that have been mined before and some that have never been mined before, to find all kinds of gems, to remarkably balance sort of the details of the history that he's telling with the broader historical sweep of the narrative, and at the same time never lose sight of the flesh and blood human beings involved in these dramas. So it's really this almost like trifocal perspective that emerges from this book and the others. So it's just really a remarkable and eye-opening accomplishment. So having said all those things, Gershom, my first question to you is simply, could you, impossible as this sounds, because you worked on this book for years and the footnotes are just mind-boggling to look at, could you briefly tell us what this book is and what it's about? And then I'll have another question.
I'm going to try to answer that, standing on one foot, tell you the entire Torah question by starting at the beginning. Okay, so as I was saying before we were so rudely interrupted, I hope the internet is more cooperative for the rest of this conversation. Half of World War II, for half the length of World War II, the major front between Germany and Italy on one hand and the Allies, particularly on the British on the other hand, was North Africa and the Middle East. Something which tends to be forgotten in American memory of the war, certainly, and even in Israel, despite the fact that Palestine was directly threatened, very closely threatened by Nazi conquest. What this book does is describe that wider canvas of the battle for the Middle East, but in particular, the hidden intrigues and the spy affair, the espionage affair that really was critical to the outcome of that battle. There was an overt battle. There were huge armies on the battlefield in Egypt and in Libya. And there was a covert battle, a espionage, an intelligence battle, which took place not only in the Middle East, but in Berlin and in Rome and in this amazing place called Bletchley Park in England, where the codes of the Axis were broken. And along with the race of the British to somehow find a way to stop Rommel's army, there was a secret battle going on to discover the incredible intelligence source that the Axis had in Cairo, and which was actually responsible for Rommel's advance and for his near conquest of the Middle East. And so this book reveals for the first time the full story of that intelligence affair and how it shaped the entire outcome of the war in the Middle East and really of the war as a whole.
Wow. And yet it's such a rich book that that's only part of it somehow. That you'd think that would be enough, but I have so much to say about this book. For somebody like, for those of us who think we know something about the history of the Middle East, right? There's these things we forget about that, Italy is bombing Tel Aviv, right? We remember how Moshe Dayan lost his arm fighting in Syria. What was he doing in Syria? The way questions of Middle East maritime lanes influence the kind of manipulations that Hitler is doing on Japan to do things to America, just astonishing. So this book though, Gershom, how does it, I think it does reshape our understanding of the Middle East in the 1940s and reshape our understanding of the context out of which the state of Israel emerges just a few years later. And I was wondering if please you could talk a little bit about that. What is this? What new avenues and vistas does this open up on the modern Middle East for us?
Well, remember that this was a battle between empires. It was a battle between the Axis powers trying to create their empires and the British Empire on the soil of the Middle East, where millions of people lived and who had their own interests, obviously very strong interests in their own fate and in their own future. So the first thing to remember is that the Middle East that we know is the Middle East that is a product of the Allies winning. It is the product of the Nazis not conquering the Middle East. I'm speaking to you from Jerusalem, and had Rommel's army and the SS murder squad that accompanied it reached Palestine in 1942, perhaps there would be no state of Israel for me to be speaking from. So in that case, in that sense, it's absolutely the foundation of what we know now. Not only that, the intrigues that went on during the war, the political decisions that went on during the war, and the young actors who would only emerge later as major actors all shaped what happened. One of the things that happened during the war is that the British, afraid that King Farouk of Egypt was siding with the Axis, carried out a coup to force him to put into power a pro-Allied prime minister. That coup is the prelude to the revolution that brought Nasser and Sadat to power in 1952, and of course shaped everything that happened after that. Meanwhile, in Palestine, even though Palestine served as a refuge for hundreds of thousands of Jews, we can talk more about the complexity of that story later. The Jews in Palestine were ready, wanted to participate in defending themselves, and they did that in two ways: by, in the large numbers, participating in the British Army, and in smaller numbers through organizations like the Palmach and the Haganah. And that created the foundation of the Israeli military. So you can't really understand what happened in 1948. What always seems like the astounding victory of these, this irregular army against the Arab armies, unless you realize that the Jewish community in Palestine had participated in extraordinary numbers in the struggle of World War II. And that was really its schooling for 1948. So everything that happened after that was shaped by these events. And I don't think you can understand the Egyptian revolution or Israel's success in 1948, or how it shaped the different characters who would dominate the Middle East for decades afterwards, without knowing what happened during these critical years.
And before handing it over to Professor Sarna, I'd just say one of the things that's so interesting is the ways in which anti-imperial struggles are figuring here in all kinds of ways, right? And sort of in the, the Nazi Empire is one with which people choose to cast their lot for a while because they think they'll be better than the British until they're disabused of that. You manage to, from these granular details, there emerges this remarkably rich and illuminating portrait.
So one of the crucial points for every group of people and every individual really in the Middle East who, there was this massive opposition to the empires being here. The question was, is my enemy's enemy my friend, or is my enemy's enemy a greater enemy? The Jewish community of Palestine said, we're tired of the British, but my enemy's enemy is a greater enemy. Within Egypt, that was a political fault line. There were people who saw the Axis as their liberators, and there was people who understood that no matter how much they wanted to get rid of the British, Germany and Italy were a greater threat to Egypt.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So I want to go back to make sure that we talk about a central insight in this book, which you mentioned, which is that the Jews in mandatory Palestine expected Rommel and the Nazis to capture the promised land, bring with them the final solution. How does that change the way we think about questions of saving Jews during World War II? It's often said, oh, if only the gates of Palestine had been open, everything would have been different. You're suggesting that actually, had the gates of Palestine been open and a lot of Jews come in, and the code not been broken, maybe it wouldn't have been so different. Only the location of the final solution would have been a little different. We can't do what if history, but certainly the implication of your book, if I read it correctly, is that we really have to rethink that what if Palestine had been open narrative, and remember how close we came to having Rommel sitting where you're sitting now. I wonder if you can expand on that. Have I correctly understood the implications, and where does that leave us?
Okay, so a couple of things. One is the Jews in Palestine were afraid of and expecting the Germans to get here by the beginning of July of 1942. They did not fully expect the final solution because they did not yet know what was happening in Europe. And in fact, right at that moment, some of the first definite reports emerged, and even Hebrew newspapers in Tel Aviv cast doubt on those reports. So these are terrible rumors that cause despair. We shouldn't believe this. So they, with the incredible amount of fear that existed, they didn't understand the full threat that they faced. Yes, the outcome of the war was extremely contingent. What seems obvious and predetermined to us now, let us put ourselves back in that place and remember not only the great historical forces that at work, but tiny bits of chance, a cable sent on this day and not that day, that might have determined the outcome of the battle. So how does this affect our understanding of Palestine, of Eretz Israel as a refuge for the Jews? In one sense, that is completely correct. Between 500,000 and 600,000 Jews were living in Palestine. The reason for the uncertainty is illegal immigration. The British themselves, their official figures, didn't take into account all sorts of people who had snuck in via the sea or the land. And those people were saved. How were they saved? They were saved because the British Army, and I'll get back to the term British Army in a moment, drew a line in the sand at El Alamein. The British Army means the British, the South African, the Australian, the New Zealand, and the Indian Army, supplemented by Free French, Free Polish, Free Czechs, etc., a virtual foreign legion opposing the Axis armies. People, I mean, really astounding when you think about it. Men off of sheep farms in New Zealand fighting in the desert in Egypt. The borders of the Holocaust are the borders where the great Allied powers finally stopped the Nazis. Britain was a refuge because Britain won the Battle of Britain and Germany did not involve Britain. Moscow, unlike other areas of the Soviet Union, was a refuge because the Red Army finally managed to stop the Nazi advance. Palestine was indeed a refuge because the British Army stopped the Axis for its own reasons, completely unconnected to us. And yet, it is also true that had the gates of Palestine been open in the late 30s and the beginning of the 40s, more Jews would have been saved. So that is our complex relationship to this history. The British were the people who closed the gates of Palestine and also the people who prevented the Nazis from getting to Palestine. And we, looking back at Israeli history, have to understand both parts of that story.
Yehudah, did you want to? You're unmuted.
No, thank you, but not muted now. One of the, if I could go from these larger issues, though I have a few more large questions, one of the wonderful things in your book is the way you bring to light and do historical justice to people who have been entirely forgotten, who did remarkable things that changed the course of the war and of history. Could you share with us like one or two of the stories that you, or the people you've managed to discover or unearth?
Yeah, and this is really for me the core of it, because history is made by people. And, you know, and these people changed the course of history even if we didn't know their names. The book is dedicated to the memory of forgotten heroes. So here's my favorite example. While working in the archives, the National Archives of Britain in London, which is, you know, Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden for a historian, the quantity of material there. I was going through the documents of the what's known as the Government Code and Cipher School, which was Britain's code-breaking signal intelligence agency. And I was looking for how the British discovered through decoding Enigma messages that the Nazis had a source in Cairo. And one day, as I'm going through these papers, I discover that the reports on Axis intelligence were written by a woman named Margaret Story, completely absent from history. Not only that, to make this even crazier, in the documents, she's consistently referred to as Miss Story. And I'm thinking half in Hebrew, and that comes out as Mistori, which means mysterious. And she was completely mysterious. There's no information about her except for these incredible reports that she wrote as she sifted through decoded German and Italian messages, trying to understand where they got their information, and was it from spies or was it from broken codes, and eventually figuring out this puzzle. So I said, I have to know who this amazing woman is. And there were bits and pieces that were information from the British. The British had an emergency census at the end of September 1939 where they registered every single person in Britain, among other things, so they could give out ration cards. So there was a record of her family that I discovered there. But there was very little in the official documents. But what I did see is that she had continued to work in intelligence after the war. Now, the successor of the government code and cipher school moved to a town named Cheltenham. And so I called the Cheltenham Local History Society and I said, could you run an ad in your quarterly newsletter? Anybody who knew Margaret's story, please get in touch with me. And the wonderful volunteer said, yes, of course I'll do that, but I'll also find her will for you because there's an online depository of wills in the United Kingdom. And she found that, and that named Margaret Story's 4 heirs. And Margaret Story died childless, but there were 4 cousins and godchildren that were listed there as her heirs, 2 of them with names like John Smith that I was never going to find, and 2 with names that after months of work, I managed to track down. And between a couple of her younger coworkers and her relatives, I was able to learn about this woman who came to work at Bletchley Park at the intelligence agency in 1940 at the rank of untrained clerk. Was born in the British colony of Ceylon to a family of aristocratic planters. Apparently spoke 9 languages. The people who I spoke to who knew her all described her as being absolutely brilliant, incredibly intelligent and sharp, incredibly shy. One woman said she was the kind of person that when she walked into your garden, she named the flowers and the birds according to their Latin names. And had no patience for anybody who was less intelligent than her. And frankly, there weren't a lot of people as intelligent as her, except for maybe at Bletchley Park. And so I was able to discover who this woman was. She retired many, many years later. She never spoke about her experiences. After the book came out, I got an email from a cousin of hers who I had not known of in Australia who said, I'm gobsmacked. Our Margaret did that. And to me, that was one of the joys of creating the story, was discovering her, bringing her to light, and restoring her to her rightful place in history.
And if I could just for a moment, if you briefly at least could talk about, we talk about Bletchley as this very British story, but you talk about the Polish people without the Poles, without whom none of this would have happened.
Yes.
Even if they didn't get any of the credit.
The Poles were also virtually erased from the story. But the real story of breaking Enigma, I'm sorry to disappoint the viewers of The Imitation Game, despite the fact that Alan Turing was a giant figure and a brilliant man and played a major role, the breaking of Enigma began in Poland in 1932. It began with a young Polish mathematician who came from an area of Poland that had previously been under German rule, so he was also a German speaker. He was recruited to Poland's Cipher Bureau, their code-breaking agency. His name was Marian Ryuski. And in 1932, he was given the job of figuring out how the Enigma cipher machine worked. Mathematicians knew that it was impossible to figure out how Enigma worked. Fortunately, Ryuski didn't seem to know that he was supposed to know that this was unbreakable. And in the space of 2 to 3 months, worked out equations that allowed him to calculate the internal wiring and the settings of Enigma. Let me make the point of how difficult that was. The number of potential ways to wire an Enigma machine, and you have to know how the wiring works to break the cipher, is a number represented by 5 followed by 92 zeros. Ryuski calculated the one combination that was the answer to that question and began to break Enigma. He was joined by 2 other brilliant young Polish mathematicians, and for the next several years, they read German Enigma messages. But as the war came closer, the Germans began to change the settings and all sorts of ways that they used the Enigma on a constant basis, and this three-man team couldn't keep up. So in July of 1939, they shared their secrets with Britain. And all of the British work breaking Enigma day after day during the war was based on what Marin Yurievsky and his two colleagues did before the war started.
And they've been entirely forgotten.
Well, they were discovered by a Polish researcher in the 70s, and years after all this happened, after working anonymously as an accountant in post-war Poland in order not to show his connection to the pre-communist regime, suddenly he was celebrated and got a medal of heroism from the Polish government.
Right.
But basically, they were written out of the story because very, very few people, even at Bletchley Park, knew that their work was based on what these Poles had done.
Now, if I could ask you another question, so that we've sort of zoomed in and now to zoom back out in a different direction. In university, when we talk about wars, historical processes, that kind of thing, right? We tend not to focus on the code breaking and the spying, and your book seems to demonstrate, or there's like an implicit thesis, the sheer centrality of this kind of espionage work. And it's not terribly glamorous espionage work, right? Like there's these two hapless characters, who sort of try to be, cloak and dagger German spies in Cairo, and they're utter failures. And the people who do the real cloak and dagger work are these very anonymous, mathematicians and so on. How does this shape our understanding of large historical events, seeing how so much is determined by these extremely arcane intelligence, code breaking ciphers, that sort of thing?
Okay, I'm not going to say that the outcome of every battle is determined by intelligence, but obviously it's a major factor. Obviously, the people who do it, their goal in life is not to be known, right? In fact, the internal contradiction of this work is the information has to be passed on to people who can use it for there to be any purpose in getting it. But the more people to whom you pass on the information, the greater the chances that the enemy will find out that you've broken their codes and changed them. So at the same time, you want to pass on this information and keep it a secret. And the other thing is that at the end of the war, the decision was made to keep this a secret permanently. One of the most amazing documents that I found, and I mean, I have to say, I'm sitting in this quiet British archive, and you go through papers day after day after day, and then you hit something, and you want to get up and shout. But you don't do that in an archive, and you certainly don't do that in the British National Archive. One of these pieces of paper was the order that went out at the end of the war to that select group of people who knew the Enigma secret. And it was an order that they may never speak for the rest of their lives. And several reasons were given, but the reason at the top was this. After the last war, the Great War, World War I, the Germans thought that they hadn't been beaten on the battlefield. There were all these conspiracy theories, the stab in the back theory. So it is absolutely essential that they believe that they were completely defeated by superior force of arms. Therefore, they must not know of our intelligence work. And therefore, you may never speak. You've made history, and you must now be forgotten. Now, in the end, the story started coming out in the 70s in various ways, in part because of that Polish discovery. The Poles were not obligated to the British order. And even then, a split developed between the people who had been in Bletchley Park. There were people who eventually wrote their memoirs, told something of what had happened. And there were people who had kept the secret for so long that they were emotionally opposed and morally opposed and incapable of speaking about it. So their role in history was hidden. The documents themselves remained secret for 50, 60, or 70 years. And so history was written without them. And so we have a narrative that does not include their role.
Gershom, how did you get into this subject? It's quite different. Your earlier work has really grown out of your journalism, its material, the Accidental Empire, and the End of Days. That was stuff you saw with your own eyes. How did you get into this story, so different in many ways from the earlier work that you've published?
Well, in fact, yes, my historical work began with my journalistic work and trying to find the historical roots of the things that I was seeing on the ground as a reporter. And I wrote 3 books about that. And I got to the point where I said, okay, I've written this. I'm not going to, keep grinding the same, wheat in the same mill. I've ground it already. I have to look for a new story. But obviously, I was interested in stories about Israel and the Middle East. I had a conversation with a friend, unfortunately no longer with us, over a Shabbat table, in which he told me that during the war, his father had been a British officer, and the British Army wanted to evacuate his mother from Palestine because that's what they were doing with the families of officers. And it brought home to me how close Palestine was to being conquered. Afterwards, I had conversations with 2 extraordinary Israeli writers who had been very young men at the time, Uri Avneri and Chaim Guri, who also told me, we knew they were coming. Chaim Guri told me the story. He bought a shirt in Tel Aviv and he takes his money out to give it to the store owner, and the store owner says, afterwards, which is to say, why pay me? We're all doomed anyway. So I went to start investigating in this and see where it would lead me. In the course of that investigation, I saw mentions, very brief mentions of this spy affair, and the story didn't fit together. Of course, the story didn't fit together because too much of it had remained secret. The early versions simply didn't have the information to make sense of it. I thought that this was an incredible story. I like good stories. So I decided I needed to track it down, and I spent years tracking down what had happened.
Yehudah, did you want to?
Well, I'm just curious, especially because any
you.
number of the people listening to us are themselves writers, researchers, and especially students, right? So for people who are thinking of undertaking research projects like this, right? Robert Caro recently, right, the legendary biographer of Lyndon Johnson, and Robert Moses gave these interviews lately where he says his credo is turn every page, turn every page. What sort of guidelines, advice, et cetera, would you give to aspiring writers or journalists or historians trying to do some project like this, where you grind stuff out of the archives and put it into a larger tapestry?
Well, let me think. There's several things. One is you need to have the experience of the archives. You need to be there, which is, by the way, something which is more difficult today. And I would like to raise a protest among historians about the fact that too many archives have remained closed longer than is necessary in the wake of the pandemic.
And do you think, by the way, do you think digitization is a problem there because you can't hold the files, you can't smell the paper?
Digitalization is a problem in several ways. One is simply the quantity of material is such that even though it's very important that some material is available digitally, it's a tiny portion of the documentary history. Second of all, a lot of the early digitalization was done in black and white. Why is this a problem? Well, for instance, Churchill always marked up papers in red, and the head of MI6 always marked up papers in green. They both wrote illegibly, but when you're looking at an intelligence document and there are red marks on it and green marks, you know that you have to decipher that handwriting because this is Churchill and Stuart Menzies, the head of MI6. A black and white document does not give you that. But also, you lose the context. And I don't know, there's something about physically holding the piece of paper in your hand, right, which is different from seeing it on a screen.
And also with digitization, you kind of have to know exactly what you're looking for, which sort of runs counter to how much research goes, right? You kind of know.
Yeah, right. And even if an entire file has been digitalized, you don't often know what was stapled to what and what was the backside of what, and all sorts of physical attributes, not just the color, that are very, very important. So I'm glad that people are digitizing stuff, but it's not a substitute for sitting in the archive. In the archive, I think that the two contrary rules that I have are know what I'm looking for and be completely open to something else. You open a file. I'm looking at the translated documents of decoded German messages. Suddenly, after I've been looking for these for months and not paying attention to little handwritten scribblings that are too impossible to make out at the bottom, I realize that those scribblings are the different settings of Enigma used by different branches of the German military, and that knowing which Enigma key settings were used is critical to understanding the story. There's a name that I didn't expect, which leads to another story. You constantly have to be ready for the fact that something in those papers is going to upset your conception of what you came for, and to run with that, to go off in another direction. The tangents could be the real story.
Now,
So-
speaking of it, if I may, just what the upsetting conceptions, one thing, a minor, one thread, is that you undo a myth propagated first in a novel by Michael Ondaatje and then by Hollywood.
Oh,
Could you
the
talk about that
Almasi.
for just a moment?
Yes. Laszlo Almasi was a Hungarian explorer, one of the two great explorers of the Libyan desert, the eastern half of the Sahara, an area as big as all of British India, that is to say, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh as today, and populated by a tiny number of people, mostly terra incognita at the beginning of the 20s. He was, in fact, a great explorer, as is pictured in The English Patient.
Because we're talking about the film The English Patient, right? The novel
right,
and the film. The English Patient.
right. He did not have a love affair with a female British explorer. He was, in fact, homosexual. I don't say gay because nobody used that term in those days, but it was a known fact that, and in fact, his lover was a young German officer during the war. During the war, he became a German intelligence officer. He was seconded by the Hungarian Air Force to the German army, and he worked under Rommel. And one of his great feats was smuggling 2 German spies into Cairo. And as an act of exploration, this was an amazing feat, crossing the desert to bring these people into Egypt. And as an act of intelligence, it turned out to be a complete failure.
Right.
Because his cargo, his human cargo, those 2 spies, well, one of their names was Epler. Great myths have been built about Johann Epler the spy. My name for him, as I was working out his story, was Inepler.
Right. Yeah. No, these spies, they're sort of like these comically inept spies that but what does that say? And then I'll turn it over to Professor Sarna and then to our audience, the cultural phenomena, the romanticization of all of this that happened in The English Patient that Ondaatje does and Hollywood does relative to the genuine history that you were able to unearth. What are some of your reflections on that?
Well,
because it speaks to like how the war is remembered, how it's thought about, how it's romanticized.
look, I don't know what he was looking for in this story. Part of the fiction in what he did is his own fiction, and part of it is that he was basing himself on early reports on Almasi and Epler, which that were written as nonfiction, but turned out to be nearly as fictional as his novel. There's a point in the book where I say that the one defense I can make of The English Patient is that it is explicitly fiction. But many of the stories that were written after the war, which were supposedly nonfiction, when you get to documents that remain secret, you discover how fictional they really were. So in this case, the key was MI5 documents, British counterintelligence documents that remained secret for 60 years, and told how Epler was actually captured and what he said during his interrogation. And it's very different than the interviews and the memoir that Mr. Epler wrote after the war.
Shockingly enough. Professor Sarna.
Gershom, and this we'll close with this and then go to the audience. You dedicate this book to forgotten heroes, And you close with this magnificent quote from the Hebrew poet Chaim Guri, whom you mentioned. Guri writes, you owe your life to nameless people and you don't know where to find them. So taking your dedication, your conclusion, I wonder if you can talk about your sense of forgotten heroes, nameless people. What are you thinking about when you focus upon them here?
Well, first of all, grand events are a collection of people. Some of them become famous, and we debate their heritage for decades and centuries afterwards. There's a huge debate going on right now about Winston Churchill. I'm not getting into that. He's one of the most amazing figures you could possibly write about, complex, contradictory, but he's known. To me, there's a value in finding people who aren't known. Guri said this to me about the Australian soldiers who fought at El Alamein. And in fact, after the book came out, I got an email from a British scientist who was born in New Zealand and whose father was in the New Zealand army and was taken captive at El Alamein, and said, this shows what my father was really fighting for. He didn't know that he was preventing the Holocaust in Palestine. So I am happy, I'm overjoyed to be able to bring out the role of those people. And that New Zealand soldier is, in a sense, better known than the people who worked in Bletchley Park, for instance, and took their secrets in many cases with them to the grave. I'll just, there were people men who worked at Bletchley Park who desperately wanted to be transferred to combat units because it was embarrassing not to be in combat. And they couldn't be transferred because you could not take the chance that somebody who knew the Enigma secret would be taken captive. It was difficult to go on a date after the war if you were a man who had worked at Bletchley Park, because people would ask you what you did during the war and you couldn't tell them. There was a price for having worked in secret. And yet those people whose names we don't know shaped our world. And I don't know, it felt necessary and important to do what I could to bring their memory into our memory.
Well, we have a lot of heroes in the audience. They do have names attached to them. They've asked good questions, and my colleague, Dr. Shana Weiss, will pose some of them.
So first of all, I just want to thank you, Gershom. There are so many questions and comments coming in, which I think speak to the way that your book and this history is still very relevant and has a lot of interest from people. We had a lot of questions about who was involved, right? And so I'm gonna list a couple of them, and then you'll feel free to elaborate on what you see fit. So there's a question about Arabs, whether Christian or Muslim, who participated. And there are also questions about whether the American soldiers or Canadian soldiers participated in the intelligence efforts as well.
Okay, so regarding the Arabs, that is a question to be answered at length and much too complicated for me to put in a single sentence. There's a certain mythology of pro-Axis Arabs, which has a basis, but should not be taken as a generalization. In other words, just to take one of the best examples of this, the Mufti, Haj Aminullah Husseini, was in fact pro-Nazi and was a Nazi propagandist. Recent research has shown that 12,000 Palestinian Arabs enlisted in the British Army, and buried in one of the military documents about a completely different subject, I found that British generals comment that we're having trouble with the enlistment of Palestinian Arabs because most of them aren't up to the physical level we need. Now, I admit I didn't go into the medical research to try to find out why that was the case, why the physical level of Jewish recruits was better than that of Arab recruits in Palestine. But that's what the British records say. So both sides of that story were there. The young Anwar al-Sadat was rounded up in the capture of a German spy ring that he had been helping in Cairo. The Egyptian prime minister at the time, who was the leading Egyptian nationalist, was nonetheless pro-Allied. So this is a very, very complicated story about which we shouldn't make generalizations. In the war on the intelligence level, after America entered the war and Britain and America began cooperating on intelligence, and by the way, the British stopped breaking American codes, which they had been doing until America entered the war. There's a very sort of embarrassing note from Churchill to Roosevelt saying, essentially, old boy, your diplomatic cables are not quite as good as you think they are. The modus vivendi was the Americans worked on Japanese codes. And that's also an incredible story, but it wasn't my story for the Middle East. But it is a story which had a tremendous influence on the war in the Pacific. It's also a partly Jewish story. The head of the American team, the founding figure of American cryptography, was a man named William Friedman. And two of his three first recruits were young Jewish mathematicians who, it seems, went into the civil service because universities and companies weren't interested in hiring Jews at the time, but you could pass the civil service exam. And they broke the Japanese diplomatic code, which should have provided warning of the coming Japanese attack, but certain American commanders didn't take it seriously enough. They afterwards succeeded in breaking the Japanese naval code, which was the key to the victory at Midway. I mean, Midway was an intelligence victory, and that's one of the turning points of the war. So to go back to Yehudah's question about the role of intelligence, both El Alamein and Midway were based on intelligence, but by different agencies.
Did Lehi or the Stern group, right, any of the more extremist Jewish groups who ostensibly eschewed any cooperation with the British, did they have a part in the war effort in North Africa?
Lehi, the Stern gang, whatever you want to call it, remained at war with the British throughout the war. They were the tiny Jewish faction who said, my enemy's enemy is my friend. And in fact, very early in the war, Lehi even made a failed attempt to make contact with the Italians and create an alliance with the Axis. The Irgun, on the other hand, for 4 years of the war, not only had a truce, the Etzel or the Irgun not only had a truce with the British, but was involved in certain covert pro-British activities, including in Iraq. And with that, I want to bracket this and say there's two stories here. One is the story that's from inside Israeli and Jewish history of the role that the Jews of Palestine played in the war, and that's true. It created the foundation for the Israeli military. In the British documents, they're a footnote, and that's also true, because relative to the size of the battle and the forces fighting, for the British, they were really a footnote. And you have to keep both of those pieces in mind when looking at this story.
Excellent point, I think, to remind us of for all historians. I wanted to ask about code breaking, and maybe less so about the science involved, although that is definitely fascinating, but more associations, its history as something involved with the military. As you point out in the book, and as popular culture has gotten fascinated by, a lot of code breakers were women. It wasn't necessarily considered a high skilled sort of operation until, let's say much after World War II. And thinking today about news about Pegasus and Israeli spyware and the role of 8200, right, Unit 8200. Do you see any connections there? And also, how do you think these incidents, even though they're obviously secret for a long time, shaped the reputation of code breaking and intelligence work?
Well, the role of code breaking in the war only really started coming out, especially the whole Enigma thing, which was so crucial, only started coming out in the 70s. Certain other aspects of the code battle remained secret. In the book, for instance, I described the story of the Italians who were not good at breaking codes, but were very good at breaking safes, and obtained many codes by breaking into embassies in Rome. And that story is almost completely missing from English language accounts. There's a whole archival story about finding that as well, but I won't go into that. So the code breaking business was, signal intelligence was a crucial factor in World War II. In fact, what made it such a crucial factor was the invention of radio communication and rapid mobile warfare. In rapid mobile warfare, you had to keep in touch with your units. You had to do that by radio. You had to send messages. As one historian said, the reality that every commander knew was that anybody who used radio was a traitor, and anybody who didn't use radio was a fool. So the meeting point of those two things is, can you break the enemy's code? It is an art and a science. It is something that depended on incredible intellectual skills. And as the codebreakers themselves described, sometimes letting your mind free associate. Leaps of intellectual genius that they couldn't explain on paper. Women were involved in that. One of the critical breakthroughs in breaking Japan's purple code was by a young female mathematician who apparently also ended up working in cryptography because women mathematicians weren't getting jobs at universities at the time. I don't know. I mean, in some ways, the curse of this discrimination was the blessing of the American military during the war. And there, even though British recruiting focused on Oxford and Cambridge, which were almost entirely male institutions at the time, there were in fact young women. This was mostly a young person's game, young women at Bletchley Park who played a critical role in the code breaking effort there.
Did the Allies, or excuse me, did the Axis powers, did they ever break any of the Allied codes?
Yes. That is part of the story. I'm going to refrain from saying a lot about that because I'm going to refrain from spoilers for the book. I mean, this is a spy story. It's a mystery, so I want to let you follow the mystery as you read the story. In general, the German and Italian code-breaking agencies were not as successful as the American and British agencies, especially the British agency. Interestingly enough, one recent book on this by a woman named Rebecca Ratcliffe argues that one of the reasons that the Germans in particular were less successful is that they were too rigid. They were too, to use a stereotype, too Prussian. Their hierarchy was too clear, too compartmentalized. The different pieces of the agency didn't speak to each other, and that got in the way of their code-breaking effort. They didn't have room for those flashes of lightning in the dark that were so critical to code breaking.
I was wondering, there's a lot of, I don't know, rumors or legends about the Templar colony in Sarna, and the role that these sort of German nationals play, their sympathies, and I know a little bit about it, you know, during World War I, but I was wondering if you could discuss if they had any relevance in World War II. Were any of them Nazi spies, right? We know that the sort of powers that be were very wary of them, but did that have any bearing in reality?
Well, first of all, the majority, if not all of, I don't know the exact numbers here. This was something which I've learned in other contexts. The Templar colony that was still in Palestine at the beginning of the war was interned in Australia. So, for instance, the German colony in Jerusalem was emptied out and became a center of the British military. And I even met somebody once doing research on the reparations to the Germans who were exiled to Australia that were part of the reparations agreement with the Germans, and a small amount of that was allocated to pay these Germans who are now living in Australia back for the property that they lost in Palestine during the war. But there are figures that I ran into in the espionage material who were Germans who grew up here and later played minor roles in German espionage efforts. In fact, that one of the legends around Almasi was that these two radio operators that worked with him who were captured were carrying a copy of the book Rebecca. And this was a tip-off because they couldn't read English, but they were carrying an English novel. Well, there's two problems with that story. There was a novel, but it wasn't Rebecca. I don't know how Rebecca got into the story, but the interrogation documents show something else. But the second thing is those two German radio operators were from the German-speaking community in Palestine, and they were both fluent in English because they'd grown up in British Palestine, and there wasn't anything shocking about them having a English language novel in their bag.
So our last question is, what are you working on next, right? What's next?
Well, I'm looking for the next story. It's been made more difficult by the pandemic. As I said, archives are either half open or closed. But I'll tell more about that when I've at the stage to tell it. I would say to scholars and researchers in the audience that my pet cause at the moment is that we should be getting together to urge archives to reopen, obviously with the necessary health conditions, vaccination certificates or whatever, but there are many, many important archives that are not accessible at the moment. And that was completely understandable at the beginning of the pandemic, but it should end. And we should be making the public call for that to happen. Not the least of which is the United States National Archives in College Park, Maryland, which at least according to their website is still closed to the public, which I think is simply unacceptable. So I hope we can win that small victory as well.
That is a crucial point. And thank you so much, Gershom. Thank you, Jonathan and Yehudah, and everyone who joined us today for an amazing program. Thank you to our co-sponsors, the German and European Studies program at Brandeis. And check us out on social media for all other hosts of events. And thank you all again today for coming. Have a lovely day.
Thank you.
Thank you all.